Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The next council will be Sarah Sharp on behalf of the Western Coastal Salish First Nations.
Mr. Commissioner, Mr. English, I want to go to page 111 of your report, please. You're discussing the total abundance estimates and the extent of overharvesting here. You look at the extent of overharvesting by looking at exploitation rates.
That's correct.
And exploitation rates are calculated based on estimates of catch as a percentage of estimated total abundance.
That's correct.
When we look at figure 22 on page 116, exploitation rates of the early Stuart sockeye were high from 1960 to 1983,
Yes.
averaging 75%.
Yes.
Exploitation rates for the early summer run sockeye were high from 1960 to 1989,
Yes.
averaging 77%.
That's what's in the report, I think.
Yes. Exploitation rates for the summer run sockeye group were high from 1960 to 1989,
Yes.
averaging 78%.
Sounds about right. I don't
It's
think
on
I had
page
it.
114.
Yeah.
113. Exploitation rates for the late run sockeye group were high from 1960 to 1989,
Yes.
averaging 76%.
Okay. Yeah. If it's what it says in the report.
We
Don't
can go to
remember
the
the numbers
page
up.
if you want. It's at page 114
114. Yeah.
in that first paragraph there. So these exploitation rates, 75%, 77%, 78%, and 76%, they reveal that rates were high up until the mid to late 80s.
That's correct. Yes.
Your report also comments that the early Stuart sockeye were probably overharvested between 1984 and 2000.
The early Stuart. Yes. It was. I think I clarified that that it was just in the primary period when productivity was declining in the late 70s and early 80s, that there was very high exploitation rates at the same time as declining productivity.
Okay. And you also note the early summer sockeye were probably overharvested between 1960 and 1989.
That's correct, yes.
And the high exploitation rates of the late run stocks pre-1993 have been implicated in the decline of the cultus sockeye.
Yes, they have been.
And since 1993, we see a declining trend in the exploitation rates for the early summer runs, and late runs.
That's right, yes.
Since 2001, the exploitation rate for the early Stuart run has also been low,
Yes,
averaging 13%.
yes.
Now, Fraser River sockeye stocks are cyclical,
Some are, some aren't.
okay, but distinguished from the Bristol Bay, Alaska run, the portfolio effect, we don't have anything like that here.
Well, we have a portfolio of stocks. We just don't have as a diverse portfolio as they have in Alaska.
Okay. To the extent that the number of returning sockeye impacts the stock recruitment and the number of effective females, there's a pattern there in the 4-year cycle.
Yes, there's definitely a strong 4-year cycle in Fraser sockeye in almost all stocks.
Okay, and we can expect the effects of high exploitation rates to be felt in subsequent years then as they affect these numbers, the recruitment and the returning females?
Yeah, the combination of exploitation rates and productivity is the key. So you could have there wouldn't be the runs that we see today if productivity had been low during this period when exploitation rates were high.
Okay.
Obviously, the managers wouldn't have permitted those kinds of high exploitation rates in that period if productivity had been lower. It's the challenges they face is adjusting the exploitation rates quickly to respond to changes in productivity.
Okay. But you did note that there was some overharvesting that was happening in that pre-1993
Yes. Yeah.
period. Okay.
Yeah.
So to the extent that returns depend on the number of spawners, these effects can be seen for many generations. We've established that. There's a bit of an echo effect, perhaps, that happens in subsequent years.
It's probably best described in the graph it shows for late run, the building up of the Adams River stock, the Shuswap stocks on the strong cycle. That's in the figure 22.
Okay.
And you can see the progressive increase from 1962 on through to the peak there in 86.
That was for the early Stuart you're speaking?
No, this is the late run. It's the
right.
graph on the,
Okay, the lower
projector.
right-hand side?
yes. And so
Okay.
it's a
Okay.
continual building of that as a result of good survivorship of those fish during the periods, obviously good productivity, and then successively increasing returns.
Okay. But you'll agree with me that we will see the effects of returning salmon in subsequent years in terms of productivity in later years.
Yeah, so if the reverse of this is if you you're not seeding the grounds and you have lower productivity, then it will ripple on through to the other in the opposite direction.
Okay, so I want to take you now to Table 1 on page 18, please.
All right.
So at the bottom here, there's calculations of averages from 1986 to 91, 1992 to 2000, and 2001 to 2009.
Yes.
When we look at the averages calculated for the fisheries for these years, for the First Nations fisheries, we can actually see that for, not the percentages, but the absolute numbers, the First Nation fisheries harvests have changed very little in the past 25 years.
Yeah, the absolute numbers, the averages are similar, yes.
Okay. Now, the ASS was not introduced until 1992.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So to the extent that we see high exploitation rates as an issue for the Fraser sockeye salmon, this is an issue that predates the AFS?
Yeah, definitely the exploitation rates that we were talking about here, most of the higher ones were prior to 92.
Okay. Now, I just want to briefly return to an issue discussed in your initial examination by Wendy Baker. You discussed some advantages, or we can call them distinguishing features, of the less complicated Bristol Bay sockeye fishery.
Yes.
Okay, you mentioned that one of those is that spawning occurs close to or a short distance away from the enumeration sites.
Yes.
Okay. You noted to implement this in the Fraser would require managing the fishery as a terminal fishery.
Yes, that's the only way you could do it similar to Bristol Bay, yes.
Okay, so it wouldn't be enough to fish at the mouth of the Fraser.
Well, there are some stocks that are reasonably close to the mouth of the Fraser, but then others are a long way
Okay.
distant.
So no ocean fisheries? No commercial?
Sorry?
No ocean fisheries with your idea of the terminal fishery? We wouldn't have ocean fisheries?
No, I'm not saying we wouldn't have ocean fisheries. I say that if you want to reduce the exploitation rates on some stocks while allowing some fisheries on all stocks, then you could have a portion of the harvest taken in traditional fishery, in the traditional ocean fisheries, but then you'd have to look at harvesting the surplus, if you like, or the ones that are more productive, more terminally. So it isn't closing down one fishery and opening up a new set of fisheries. You have a mixture of fisheries.
Okay, so we're not talking about shutting down the entire ocean fishery, no fishing for the health sick, none of the island nations. We're not talking about something like that?
I'm not talking about that, no.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear. Okay, and you also said that it's possible to count the marine harvest. We're able to assess those numbers? No.
Well, is it possible to?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it is definitely possible, and there is an accounting of marine harvests, and that you can see right here in this table. Those are the estimates of what is harvested.
Right. So now, I'm just going to go back now to, you were brought to tables 6 and 7 earlier today, this morning.
Yes.
And we looked at the accuracy, precision, and reliability of the catch monitoring programs used to estimate the FSC harvest for Fraser sockeye.
Yes.
And you were pointed to the table for 1992 to 2000, table 6.
Yes.
Okay, we also, and then there's for 2001, 2009, just looking at this table, I see that the quality of catch estimates by your measure has improved since 1992 till 2001, for those years you've assessed? Gone
Yeah,
from
that-
fair,
they-
variable, and fair to good, good, fair?
Yes, definitely the reason for having the two tables is to emphasize the difference between the periods.
Okay, so for table 14 then, we looked at, that's on page 42, sorry. We looked at the equivalent table for the commercial fishery.
Yes,
Okay. We just have it for 2001 to 2009?
that's correct.
Okay. You were asked earlier for the data for the years, or the breakdown here between the different gear types.
Yes,
Do you have the data for the years preceding 2001 for the commercial fishery?
I have the data that you see in Table 1, that goes back to the beginning of that time series,
Okay.
and other tables that were prepared by I think those ones go back, yes, to 86.
Table 1 goes back to 86, yeah.
Was that to 86? Okay, yes. So all the tables that go back to 86 have information on these same panel areas and non-panel area breakdown, because they come from the Pacific Salmon Commission files.
Great. Would you be able to produce that data as well for us?
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, it's Brenda Gertner for the First Nations Coalition, and with me is Leah Pence, and I believe I have about 45 minutes for my time, and I am optimistic that my work with Mr. English today can be completed in that period of time. Mr. English, I wanted to thank you for the work that's reflected in your report and your helpful evidence today and yesterday. I find it very direct, and you're very easy to read, and I think that's a compliment that scientists should take. And I want to primarily focus on the methodology. My clients are pretty satisfied with the methodology and data in the report, which supports your conclusions. However, there are some facts and some recommendations that you have relied upon that we think could use some further explanation, and perhaps go a couple steps further, if you will, with me. And ultimately, I'm going to, at the end of my questions of you, take you to your recommendations and tweak some of them, or ask you to tweak some of them if you're willing to. And then if time allows, I've got a couple questions relying on your expertise and the terms of reference that Commissioner Cohen has in front of him in this work.
All right.
So I'm going to start first with page 1, paragraph 1 of your executive summary, right at the beginning of the report. And you mentioned a very strong statement there, I think, that there is limited documentation for DFO catch monitoring program, few estimates of precision, and minimal verification at landing sites for most Canadian commercial fisheries. I think he's got it. Yeah, they'll catch up with it. 42% of the harvest. And then you say leaves substantial room for improvement in the catch monitoring program. Now, I just want to clarify, and this is probably my linear mind, so bear with me. Because it's so prominent in your material, it's your first thing that you go to, and it's also one of your first recommendations. Do we take anything from that? Is that a priority from your work, and given the report that this is the most important thing to look at, or is that just because that's how it was reflected in your terms of reference?
No, there's no order to the points in the executive summary, other than they follow the order. No, priority order. So they follow the order of the sections in the report.
Thank you. And that's similarly true for your recommendations.
Yes, yes.
Now, why is the level of verification used in the commercial gillnet fisheries in Area D and E so different from the verification that is now being used for First Nations gillnet economic fisheries at the mouth and in the Lower Fraser? And in particular, I'll turn your attention to the evidence that came out yesterday and is in your report, that managers are achieving or are now imposing a 35% verification in the gillnet commercial fisheries, and have now achieved 100% verification in the economic opportunity fisheries for gillnets of First Nations.
Well, there has been certainly a focus on the First Nation fisheries because of some of the problems that have occurred in the 1990s to try and get more reliable catch numbers for those fisheries. So that's created a lot of the focus. During that same period in the 1990s, there was a reliance mostly on the sales slip system, And it wasn't until the late 90s that the deficiencies in the sales slip reporting system for the regular commercial fishery, I'll call it, the general commercial fishery, it's sometimes referred to, that concern over the sales slips created a need to implement independent monitoring systems. So the solution was to conduct aerial surveys and obtain information on catch per effort as a sample. So treat the commercial fishery more like a sport fishery is being treated, where you're doing surveys and sampling, coming up with an estimate that's independent of the fishermen reporting their catch in total. And so that's the approach that has been used since, and for most of the 2000. It was sort of in development in 99 and 2000 and has been improved over recent years. I think the emphasis towards going to 100% catch reporting is it puts more of the cost associated with the fishery back on the fishermen. So these are for the seine ITQ fisheries and troll ITQ fisheries. And that, because maintaining independent catch monitor systems can be expensive. You have to do aerial flights or on-the-ground counts, compile that. Whereas if you can move to a 100% verification of catch at landing sites, then and have fishermen land their fish at a specific site, it's going to be less expensive to monitor that way, and it puts the onus back on the industry. And it's following a pattern that has occurred for similar fisheries with the ground. We heard of this morning about the groundfish fisheries and some other fisheries, halibut fishery.
But I'm still not quite clear, why are we aiming for 35% verification in the commercial gillnet marine fisheries and 100% verification in the First Nations economic fisheries?
Well, I don't think it's a question of what we're aiming for. There's a transition going on from this program of doing independent catch monitoring programs with gear counts and catch per effort estimates to verification. So they went to 100% for the seine and troll ITQ fisheries in 2010, and they set the requirement at 35% for the Area E, I think because of logistics associated with trying to go from where they were in 2009, or I guess it was a few years since they really had much of a fishery. So where we were in the previous year when they had a fishery to what was being required for 2010.
And so from your perspective, 35% is not a necessary accuracy requirement. It's a stage in getting up to 100%. Is that where?
Yeah, I think it's an effort to improve it. Whether the department's going to set a requirement to go to 100% dockside monitoring, catch verification for that fishery is yet to be seen. They obviously ran for quite a number of years without that requirement, but doing the catch estimates by these other methods I just described.
Now, I'm aware, and this is a bit of a challenge given where we are in the procedures with the inquiry, but there's a policy and practice report that will be filed coming forward, and from that policy and practice report, I understand that Area E gillnetters have strongly opposed the mandatory landing site requirements, and that they've argued that those are cost time and cost money, and that they have to land these set packing sites. They're going to restrict their abilities to deliver to their buyers and disrupt their marketing abilities. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And for some reason in 2010, DFO agreed to drop the mandatory landing site requirement. Are you aware of that?
In 2010?
Yes.
Well, this is for the Area E. What I was told was that they had a requirement for 35% of the catch to go through the sites, not all the catch.
Were you able to review that information in preparation of this report?
Well, that's what I've got those pieces of information from the people who were involved in the Area E management in the last year.
I guess as you can tell by my questions, my clients have always been concerned about making sure that fisheries are treated equally, and there's, at least from my perspective, from this vantage point, I can't see any difference between Area E and Area D and the lower Fraser gillnet fisheries, economic fisheries. They're all gillnet, most of those are gillnet fisheries. They're all located pretty close to the mouth of the river or from it. They're often accessing the same markets. Why would one require 100% verification and another require 35% verification? You can appreciate that that might cause problems on the ground.
Yes, and it has been raised with a number of the groups that I've talked with, and First Nation groups, that they feel it's not fair that they have a requirement which is more stringent than those for the other fishermen.
And if I could take you to Exhibit 428 for a moment, are you familiar with the work that the ISDF has done, the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum on Monitoring and Compliance? Are you, first of all, familiar with the ISDF?
I have heard about that process. I've not participated in it.
All right, if you go to page... First of all, page 2, on the forward, you'll see that the Monitoring and Compliance Panel, which was describes itself as on page 2 on the forward. Mr. Lund, do you see that? Yeah. You'll see it. The M&C panel, as it has been dubbed, is an independent collection of representatives from the Aboriginal, recreation, commercial, and conservation sectors. But while independent, the panel works closely with DFO in a collaborative attempt to map a better pathway for monitoring and compliance.
Yes.
So that helps you a little bit understand the work that this group is doing. And if you go to page 5 of that report, and in particular Principle 2, they strongly recommend using consistent monitoring standards. Do you see that?
Yes.
I'm wondering, you didn't mention that in your report as part of your recommendations. I wonder if you could take a moment to look at that principle and wonder whether or not you might add that as a necessary or a useful step in ensuring going forward we've got good monitoring and compliance standards. Sorry, sorry, page 5 of the report? Sorry.
My apologies.
No, it's okay. It's me.
Unfortunately,
I'm probably
I
just
had
going
page,
too fast.
I
I'm
had
sorry.
page 5 here, so
You've got it, right? And you've
Yeah.
got Principle 2?
yes.
Is there anything in that principle that you disagree with, or are you happy to adopt that recommendation as a useful way of going forward in monitoring and compliance within Fraser River sockeye fisheries?
I think the issue of just a consistent monitoring standards is good as long as those standards are adequate. Like you can have a consistently poor.
Yes.
They may have to be a little inconsistent initially to get things, to change things for fisheries that are not believed to be monitored adequately now or in any one period. But once you've established a reliable set of catch monitoring systems, yes, maintaining them consistently. And I think that was the hope, is that initially the sales slip system was going to provide that for commercial fisheries, for example, continuously, as it had for many years, but it kind of broke down. There was a change in how fish were being landed and how catch was being sold, and so what they had to do was adapt. So you need to be consistent where you can be, but adaptable to changes in the fishery over time.
And then finally, just a last question on the catch and our catch monitoring component of your paper. At page 44, and I don't think you need to go there, you just mentioned the 100% monitoring for the ITQs. You'll agree with me that ITQs aren't a necessary part of getting 100% monitoring. I mean, they're not linked at the hip or anything or anything like that. It's just a sufficient way of, or it seems to be an incentive that DFO is using now to try to get some of these fisheries to increase monitoring and the cost of monitoring on ship.
Yeah, you don't have to have an ITQ fishery to have 100% dockside monitoring.
Thank you. Which is where you begin to summarize the First Nations FSC fisheries. And it's my assessment that a number of facts that you rely upon and present in the pages from 25 to 26 and onward do not actually go directly to your assessment of the catch monitoring accuracy, precision, and reliability of the First Nations fisheries, but really are background or descriptions of the fishery. And I need to draw your attention to some of the things that are said there, because from my client's perspective, they're either inaccurate or incomplete. And I don't know what these pages in your report might be used for in the future. So I am going to point out that, again, and you've agreed with me as you began this, that your expertise is not necessarily on traditional fisheries practices of Aboriginal people. Your expertise lies in the scientific management processes in a modern context. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
All right, so then just bear with me for some of these questions and we'll get some of this looked after. You are the author of this part of the report, if I got your evidence correct, right?
That's right.
So if you can go to page 25 and that first paragraph. First of all, you call it First Nations FSC fisheries and then you describe it as the management structure. You'll agree with me that it's the management structure presently used by the Government of Canada through DFO to manage the FSC fisheries by First Nations.
That's correct.
And you'll agree with me that the special obligation you're talking about in that first paragraph is the constitutional obligation that DFO has to manage the fisheries pursuant to Section 35 or treaty rights that are concluded. Is that what you're referring to there?
Yes.
And what did you mean in that first sentence when you said that since the late 1800s, when Canada asserted management control of the Pacific coast fisheries, the ability of First Nations to harvest for food purposes has been integral? I found that word to be fascinating, integral to the overall fisheries management system. What were you trying to communicate to us there?
I guess it's been an issue making sure that First Nations have access to salmon for food for most of that period. There has been periods when it has been a problem, but it's been a integral challenge for the management agencies to deal with that one in one form or another throughout that period.
Right, integral challenge is something I think my clients could live with. So let's move on to AFS. You describe AFS as the management structure. You're aware that DFO is trying to use a bunch of tools in their toolbox now. They've got an AROM and they've got a PICFI and now they've got treaties with Tawasin. So it's not the only management tool by any means that DFO is trying to use. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But it is for some reason the one that you focused on in this report.
It's the one that was noteworthy in terms of how it has affected the catch monitoring component of the First Nation fisheries.
And for that, you mean it was the funding arrangement beginning in the post-Sparrow environment that helped to put some capacity into First Nations to provide some better collaboration with DFO. Is that what you meant?
That's what I mean, yes.
Okay, and are you aware also that there are strong concerns by First Nations around the type of management that arises from the AFS, in particular the notion that DFO has the ultimate decision-making powers and that they have to sign agreements that say that in order to obtain this funding?
Yes, I'm aware of
You're aware that
a lot
causes
of the details. Yeah.
You're aware it causes significant friction between DFO and some Aboriginal groups.
Yes, and it's the reason why there is not agreements in every year, as identified later in the report.
All right, so then at page 20, well, page 21, and then you say again, and then at page 26, you suggest that 72 First Nations target Fraser sockeye. Where did you get that number?
I think that's the total in the table that is provided under Table 5.
All right, and so that's at page 28. And then you go on to say that 39 groups representing most of these First Nations have AFS agreements. And currently, most First Nation groups in BC have AFS agreements with Canada. You say all of these things. Are you relying on that conclusion all on Table 5?
It's largely being, because we asked for this actually for multiple years, and we were only able to get it for 2009. So a lot of the conclusions, yes, are derived from the information from the 2009 documentation that was provided by DFO.
Maybe I'll just ask this question then. Are you aware that the Lahakma communities that are along the main stem and the Stotlium communities, do you know those two tribes?
Yes, I do.
Are not signatories to AFS agreements?
I know that there's groups that within the Fraser that are not signatory.
And you know their territories, you would describe them as fairly significant areas within the middle part of the Fraser that don't have AFS agreements?
Yes.
Yes. So when you say most of them have AFS agreements, that might be a little bit of an overstatement?
Yes, and I guess it would look at it you could look at it two different ways. One is just the portion of the total number of First Nations versus the portion of the First Nations that, in terms of their catch of Fraser Sockeye. So,
now, you weren't relying on the fact of whether they were an AFS signatory to do your catch monitoring and assessment,
No.
though, were you?
No.
So that helps us in terms of that conclusion. Are you also aware that the outstanding issues between First Nations and DFO regarding the responsibilities around management and appropriate co-management are significant hurdles that have not yet been overcome and are hurdles for the management of the Fraser River Sockeye?
yes,
And you're also aware that Aboriginal traditional fishing locations within the Fraser the actual locations are very culturally relevant, and in many situations they're long-standing within families that have used very specific sites that are sacred responsibilities for that family?
yes,
And would you agree that respecting those relationships and those locations will be highly useful and helpful in developing functional management structures for ongoing management of the Fraser River Sockeye and the FSC fisheries,
certainly, yes,
and including the movement towards terminal fisheries?
yes. They'll have, it's very important that whatever fisheries are conducted in an area where First Nations have tradition of harvesting fish, respect the use of those fishing sites and areas. We've experienced it firsthand in just doing research, where we understand that if we don't talk with the First Nations in the area, then we're going to create a lot of problems for ourselves. And so we abide by that, and virtually everywhere we've done work, whether it's the Fraser or the Nass or the Skeena, working very closely with First Nation groups for those reasons.
Great, and then would you also then agree that that long-standing knowledge and relationship to the fishery and those very local situations is an asset to the long-term management of the Fraser River Sockeye salmon and not an impediment?
Certainly, definitely working with people that understand how the fish move through their territory is absolutely vital.
So often when we hear the challenges with a number of First Nations along the Fraser, we could actually change our glasses and see it as an opportunity to obtain local and historical information that will be extremely useful in developing assessments of things like habitat and habitatability.
Sure. More information, the better.
All right, so I'm going to now turn to the non-retention fisheries section of your paper, and I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Mr. Rosenblum touched on earlier today and take you a little further. And I want to start with what you've done at page 56 of your report. And take you to that last paragraph, and in particular, beginning with the sentence, although salmon fisheries are typically managed to harvest a specific species or stock, it is often impossible not to intercept other co-migrating salmon, including some that are threatened. And my clients took quite a bit of interest in the three options that you set out there. In particular, you can either continue to harvest abundant stocks until they're extinct. That's one option, hopefully not an option that we're looking for. Second, you can shut down lucrative fisheries to protect threatened ones. And third, you can apply restrictions in the form of release requirements for non-target species or stocks. And you look at the various different options that you have there, and then you go onward and say release requirements have been applied to several gear types. And then you say releasing fish has become used increasingly in management, but is predicated on the assumption that true release mortality estimates are known. And then you spend 2 pages, and Mr. Rosenblum has taken you to some of these at which you clearly identify that that assumption is not founded in the information we have today. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're lacking information on the release related mortalities for a lot of the different species.
And it's not just the catch and release on the anglers, it's catch and release in the marine also that we don't have information on either. Is that correct?
Wherever catch and release occurs, there's variable levels of information. So you can go to sport fisheries at different parts of the coast, and you'll find better information in some areas and poorer in other areas. You can look at releases from seine vessels fishing in the North Coast or in Barkley Sound that have been studied in those areas, and you can see there is some information. This specifically is looking at the fisheries associated with Fraser sockeye and the areas where Fraser sockeye are being released in these fisheries. So therefore, it's focused mostly on the fact that there's very little Fraser sockeye being released in other South Coast fisheries, commercial fisheries. Most of it occurs associated with the in-river fisheries for sport fisheries.
So if you go back to those three options that you had at page 56, Mr. English, I can only make the assumption if we don't want it to be extinct and we don't have the information to rely upon for catch and release, the only thing we can do is change where we're fishing.
We can alter the methods and locations of fishing, yes, to reduce the impacts for cases where you are releasing. If you're retaining the fish, if you're not releasing them, then they're dead, and you're harvesting them. So it's only those places where you're actually releasing the fish and with the intention that they survive, where this is an issue. I think it's the writing here was to indicate that a lot of the research, it's a broad subject, and a lot of the research has been focused on Chinook and coho and steelhead, because these are species that are typically needed to be released in fisheries that are targeting sockeye and pink, for example, or chump. And so there's a broader essentially wealth of information than just what is applicable to Fraser sockeye fisheries.
Sorry, I just got sidetracked with how much time I have left. All right, but what I read that earlier paragraph to say was you got three options when you're dealing with co-migrating stocks, that some of which are running the risk of extinction. Two of those options aren't on the table right now, as I see it, as I read your report. One of them could be.
Yeah, well, obviously they're extremes, and the intent is that they find we get more information, and where you allow release fisheries, where you're going to release fish, you get more information on the survivorship. So you aren't just assuming 100% survival. So you can look at it and say, what's the likelihood of survival of these fish? Study it directly, or relate it to other studies done. What's likely to be the survivorship of those fish being released. So it doesn't remove what's proposed under 3 as an option.
There's en route losses and what you do at page 61. You'll agree with me that we only call a dead, uncaught salmon an en route loss once it's lost in the river after it's been enumerated at the mission. That seems to be the nomenclature right now. Is that correct?
Or the en route loss is really referring to fish that we estimate have gone by mission but didn't make it to the spawning ground.
So we don't have data on en route losses in the marine before the mission, but clearly there may be en route losses after fish have passed by the marine fisheries going into the river.
Yes, could be there too.
And so water temperatures could, as they're increasing, affect a fish that's been caught and potentially released, either deliberately or undeliberately, from nets in the marine.
Yes.
It's not just in-river fisheries that we're worried about with respect to that.
Well, the reason for the focus on in-river fisheries is because the temperatures are much higher in river than in the ocean.
But if the marine fisheries are causing some of the challenges the fish is experiencing by the time they get into the river, we shouldn't close our eyes on that.
No, yeah, they're all having their impact. If we weren't in the way of these fish, they would have a lot less stress on them.
And I need to take you to page 61 at the bottom of the telemetry studies, in particular the last sentence, because I'm very concerned with what you're suggesting here and want to make sure we understand this. While there is little that can be done about annual water temperatures or difficult passage points, it is possible to minimize cumulative effects environmental and fisheries related by disassociating the timing and location of in-river fisheries from these other stressors. You're not suggesting that we close First Nation fisheries in the canyon or other places where there may be, what did you call them, difficult passage points. Those are very traditional Aboriginal fishing sites. Are you? That's not what you're suggesting in that sentence, are you?
Well, there may be years when, with extreme temperature, that you need to look at different harvesting methods.
But surely, but first of all, surely you'd be looking at making sure there's enough fish that pass so that those first in priority can access those fish.
Yeah, so they can access the fish, but at the same time, we don't want to have conduct fisheries where we know we're going to be stressing fish in warm periods of time, and some of those fish are not going to be removed. So you have a target number of fish that you would like to catch in a fishery, and you want to have those fish removed without having an impact on the other fish that are either going to fall out of nets or not be captured efficiently. So there's different capture methods that can ensure that all the fish that are encountered are retained, and the other ones swim upriver and are able to spawn.
All right. And let's go to net fallout just on that for a moment. In your report, you seem to focus on net fallout in the river. A gillnet is a gillnet, if I understand it, and a gillnet in Johnson Strait or in Area E or any of those things can also have net fallout. Will you agree
Yes,
with me on that?
yes.
Why is it that you seem to be worried only about gillnets in the river?
It's a cumulative stress issue, and it's because we don't, with the tools that we have been using and the complexity of working in the marine environment, it's more difficult to assess the impact of marine fisheries in terms of, and the survivorship of fish in marine fisheries due to potential things like net fallout. This information is coming from the in-river telemetry studies that have been done in looking at locations of losses.
But surely if we've got gillnets with dropout in the Johnson Strait or in Area E, we want to look at that, don't we? That's one of the first places the salmon are getting.
Yes, you want to, wherever you have the theory here is that the combination of temperature, difficult passage points, stress in migration, and fisheries is probably the case where you're going to have bigger stresses, but it doesn't mean you're not going to have any stress associated just with net fallout. In fact, one of the biggest stresses might be fish not being retained in the net because they struggle as they encounter the net, and if they struggle long enough, some of them escape, and they may have to do that several times in order to get from A to B.
And in addition to other fishing methods, there's lots of things we can do to improve gillnets. Is that correct?
To improve gillnets?
Yeah, so we can make sure they're using the right monofilaments, we can make sure they've hung them right, we can make sure that they've got the floats and that the lead lines are properly located within, depending on where. There's a lot of education that could be done. Is that true?
Yeah, there's definitely better gillnets and worse gillnets, for sure.
And the obvious point is that Bristol Bay is almost all gillnets, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a lot of gill netting. Well, it is effectively all gill nets, either set gill nets or drift gill nets.
There seems to be two options for precautionary management in a situation where we've got, hold on, let me rephrase this, I'm rushing too quickly. Given the unreliability of preseason forecasts already agreed upon, would you agree that no significant or strong fisheries in the marine should be occurring before in-season data confirms the peak of the runs?
Before the peak.
So by the time we get some accuracy and the actual abundance of the run.
It's common to allow fishing to occur as you approach the peak, with it being conservative. Like you're not going to start off with a multi-day fishery, for example. You might start off with a fishery that lasts a few hours earlier in the run, just to get a sense of how many fish are coming back. But definitely, it's the closer, the more you can be confident that you're near the peak, the better your test fishing, and the peak really is the 50% point. So that you can say, oh, we've seen this many fish so far. If we're roughly around the 50% point, then we can expect there's another half of the run to come. So that's often done for the early components of runs. So that gives you an indication of whether the run in that particular year is coming back early or late.
So what I want to stress is that, as I understand the changing climate conditions and the lack of certainty going into any particular run, the only time you can really become more secure about the size of a particular run is just after the peak has been identified.
Yes.
And so if we're going to be precautionary, we're going to have to wait for that, for any significant effort fisheries to occur.
Yeah, so there's two goals though in the fisheries management, is to harvest to not exceed what can be sustainably harvested, or not harvest into your escapement target, but at the same time distribute the fishing pressure over the run of the fish, so you're not always waiting until the last half of the run to mount all your fisheries. So that would alter the run timing and possibly have negative effects on the biology.
All right, so there's two options that flow from that with the Fraser River. You can either move your test fisheries further out and get your data better and before, and do your stock composition before you open any of the marine commercial fisheries, or you can move the fisheries further up the river, so you've clearly had an opportunity to identify the peak and identify the stock composition. Would you agree with those two options?
Yeah, there's those options, and the fact that with the current test fishing locations, they're providing information in advance of other fishing areas in the marine environment, because they're occurring in Johnstone Straits and Juan de Fuca Straits, if anywhere between 5 and 7 days prior to when fish will arrive at the mouth of the Fraser or the lower Fraser.
So do you want to move them further out so you can get the necessary information on the peaks and stock composition, which I understand takes at least 2 days of DNA sampling before you open the marine?
Well, moving the test fisheries further to the ocean, further along the migration of salmon, becomes problematic, because the location of landfall of these stocks may vary. Some years you could have information from Alaska, for example, telling you what's coming back, because a lot of them are migrating through the Alaskan fisheries. Other years, virtually none of them will be migrating through the Alaskan fisheries. So you have to conduct your test fisheries at locations where Fraser sockeye are going to be consistently vulnerable to those test fisheries. And that's why they're located in that current location.
So you agree with me then that the most obvious next choice is to move the fisheries more in river?
The earlier fisheries, the conservative approach is to have those definitely inside those test fisheries and more towards the river or upriver than in the approach waters.
So going forward, as we begin to look at remanaging the fisheries for sustainability, we should be strongly looking at how we can catch more fish in river.
Yeah, do it in a way which is not going to have these other problems with temperature.
Thank you. Let's just turn briefly to in-season estimates. And I note at page 85 of your report, I'm going to read it while Mr. Lund finds it. You say, in general, the in-season forecasts have been sufficiently accurate, precise, reliable, and timely to make the management decisions needed to achieve the harvest rate goals defined for each of the 4 run timing groups. And I know you didn't say the escapement goals, and I know you didn't say conservation units, and I expect that was deliberate on your part. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And so we don't have in-season forecasts that are sufficient to ensure escapement goals for conservation units.
Well, it's not how they're being used, so we can't evaluate it, what's being done until, once they're defined, then the test of whether the current in-season forecast or in-season estimation system is adequate will be once those goals are defined, and then how well we do to achieve them.
All right, so we don't have that. Now, I want to ask you about these 4 run timing groups. They're often used for much of what we're doing in season right now. As I understand it, there are a number of early summer sockeye populations, in particular the Scotch and the Seymour and others, that are migrating with summer stocks, and particularly the Stalaco and the late Stewarts. Why are they located in the early summer populations, and is that causing problems from your perspective?
Well, certainly there's a significant overlap, and in more recent years, it may have been historically that there was less overlap between those run timing, or between those stocks, and we're in those run timing groups for those reasons. I'm not clear. I haven't asked the people who were managing the resources back when those stock run timing groups were defined, why they chose those specific stocks.
But you'd agree with me that they're more accurately part of the summer stocks, that's where they're actually migrating, than they are the early summer.
Certainly that's been my observation in recent years. Most of my intensive work on the Fraser started in 2002, and in all the years that since then, when we've been looking at the runs and the migration timings, it appears there's a lot of overlap between Scotch and Seymour, for example, and the other summer run stocks.
And so to the extent that we're moving forward, making decisions right now on run timing groups, would you agree that it would be useful to make sure we redo the composition of these run timing groups so they accurately reflect how these fish are returning?
That would be good, yes.
And so that would be a recommendation you would add to your paper?
To the extent that it's appropriate, because I'm not sure that, I think my paper is submitted and final.
But you can adopt it now as a recommendation that you would make to the commissioner for something to consider in the improvement of the Fraser River sockeye?
Yeah, in the context, I guess, of this hearing or testimony, I don't think correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't get the impression I'm supposed to go back and make edits to the...
No, I'm not asking you to
Okay.
make edits.
Yeah.
But you would adopt that as a useful recommendation for
Yes,
the
for sure.
improvement of Fraser River sockeye?
Yes.
And is it your understanding that the 4 run timing groups is mainly a constraint of the Pacific Salmon Treaty?
I guess because it's a traditional approach that has been used by the Fraser panel to manage these stocks. I don't know whether it is actually referred to in the Pacific Salmon Treaty that must be done in that way, but it could be in there.
All right, I just have briefly, again, I think I'm going to be pushing my time estimates, but let's see how I do. I want to turn to escapement targets very briefly, and then particularly the work in that Mr. Liedem did today with you, and was grateful for it being done. But I have to go a couple more steps with you, if I may. The challenge of using stock recruitment data to set targets is that right now we have data on 19 indicator stocks, correct?
That's correct.
And as I understand your report, of the 7 of those indicator stocks, we don't have sufficiently reliable stock recruit data to do assessments on escapement targets. Is that fair to say?
For 7 of the 19?
Yeah, if I take you to paragraph 2 on page 75, that might help us. I just want to make sure I've got this right, because if we're going to start anywhere to do this, let's start with the indicator stocks. But
Yes. So which page is it on?
page 75, paragraph 2
Paragraph 2.
is how I best understand that.
Okay, so one thing that really helped clarify, this is related to preseason forecasts. So it doesn't say you can't do stock recruitment, it just means that there isn't a good relationship between the forecast and the return.
But that is the information we would also be using to, or maybe it isn't. What
isn't.
information would we use for escapement targets on the 19 indicator stocks?
Well, one very basic piece of information would be the capacity of the freshwater habitat to support.
All right, I'm going to take you there in a second, but I just want to get a sense of what other data do we have? What data would we have for the 19 indicator stocks that we could immediately turn to start setting escapement targets?
Well, it's well laid out in the Sue Grant report et al. Working paper for all these 19 stocks, the data that, and they go through it in exhaustive detail. It's stock recruitment data, not run forecasting data that we're
Okay,
using.
all right, let's leave that. So your other option, and I'm going to go to that because that's really where I wanted to focus, and I wanted to make sure we had the data right, is you say we ought to start with what's often been called as the garden, and I'm going to call it a wild garden as distinct from anything that sounds domesticated. And we need to understand the nature of that wild garden. And do you agree with that as a good
Yes.
place to start? And you need to confirm this at the present spawning habitat. And the commissioner has actually heard from a number of my clients about their views that a lot of the present habitat is underutilized in some of the areas, and that there's a lot more habitat that could be used. Is that your understanding of the Fraser?
I don't have that, I guess, level of detailed understanding, certainly not equivalent to your clients.
And so you would actually agree that working closely with First Nations to understand that wild garden would be a very useful step.
Yes, definitely.
And in fact, it might be one of the more useful steps in quickly moving to some collaborative and co-management opportunities.
Yes.
And so what we would want to do is assess from their historical knowledge and otherwise the true larger capacity of some of the spawning ground areas of the Fraser.
Yes, certainly.
That would be a good place to start.
Yes, and understanding that there might well have been substantial changes over time. Some of those areas may be better today than they were historically, some may be worse.
All right, I just have a couple of final areas that I want to cover. I'm going to briefly turn to Bristol Bay. As I understand it, of course, we can't change geography, and we can't, but we can change fisheries and management styles. And so, if we wanted to learn from the Bristol Bay, and in particular, wanted to adopt some of their conservation approaches and more effective management approaches, one of the ways we can do that is to move our fishing closer to the natal streams and the lakes. That would make us closer to the 9 areas in Bristol Bay. Is that correct?
In principle, yes.
Well, it's actually practical and possible.
Yes, the extent that you could do the harvesting in those areas, similar to what, if you wanted to harvest similar numbers of fish, there might be logistical differences or difficulties doing that in some terminal areas. But the idea, the concept or principle of moving fisheries closer to the spawning areas gives you a lot more control over the returns to specific stocks.
As I heard your evidence yesterday, and as I read your report, that's a critically important component of the success of Bristol Bay, is they've got a very close relationship between when the people who open the commercial fisheries and that which is happening on the spawning grounds. Correct?
Yeah, it seems to have worked to ensure that they get their escapement goal.
And so what we might want to do is increase capacity to allow ourselves to do that.
Certainly, that's one approach, yes.
And I didn't see that in your recommendations, in your written recommendations. Is that a recommendation you have for Commissioner Cohen?
What, to
Increase
terminal fisheries?
Yes, and increase our knowledge about terminal fisheries and increase our abilities to harvest large amounts of fish in terminal areas, therefore allowing ourselves to make more precautionary decisions associated with escapement.
I think it's one that needs to be evaluated, just like we need to evaluate what escapement goals should be. So there's once you define the goals for the different stocks, you can determine to the extent to which you can harvest those in mixed stock fishing areas and the extent that you'll need to move fisheries more terminally, and that may vary from year to year and stock to stock. But we shouldn't be eliminating opportunities that exist and eliminating alternative forms of harvesting fish just because it wasn't used in the past or wasn't used in recent history.
Thank you. And in fact, it's not only we shouldn't eliminate, we should take active steps to figure out how we can do that.
Yes.
Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah. I say that it goes in the sequence that you determine what you need to do, look at the fish and say, what do we need to do to achieve the goals that we have for these populations of fish, and then implement the fisheries in a way which allows you to achieve those goals.
And in order to do all of that, it's a fairly complex, primarily because of the longstanding vested interests we may have in the Fraser. Would you agree that it's also going to be very useful to have structured decision-making processes that are clear and transparent in order to make those decisions? That would be extremely useful from a management perspective.
Yeah, clear and transparency is really important.
And that wouldn't necessarily be the Fraser River panel, because that's 50% of the U.S., but rather we need to have that at home in Canada dealing with our terminal fisheries. Is that correct? Would you also go with me as far as that?
Yeah, we have to deal with our domestic fisheries separate from international obligations.
Thank you. I'm going to just, I think I've just been given a little bit more time by my friend, and so I'm going to take about 5 more minutes, or maybe 5 more minutes with you, Mr. English. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to take you to your recommendations because I just want to be clear on. And so I just wonder if, given our discussions on consistent monitoring across the sectors, would be something you would add now to recommendation number 1?
Certainly consistently good monitoring across the sectors, yes.
Thank you. And to recommendation number 2, you would add commercial gill nets in area E and D as something that we need to look at as it relates to net dropout.
Certainly, yes, you could add that.
And given the discussion you had with Mr. Taylor, would you also be willing to unlock the recommendation in 3 to say that higher priority for human and, if necessary, financial resources should be placed on setting clear escapement goals and in-season decision-making management models to help ensure we meet those goals?
Certainly, yes.
And that we need to clearly communicate to all harvesters and the public the limited usefulness of pre-season forecasts and the uncertainties associated with them?
Yes.
And then with respect to number 6, as I understand your evidence, that we should be talking about conservation units rather than indicator stocks and run timing groups. Would you agree with that?
I think we're talking about both. Some of them are the same. Conservation units are very similar to indicator stocks. And the indicator stocks will provide us information on conservation units. And in fact, they may be all the information we have for specific conservation units because we don't have a monitoring system in place. Or some of these conservation units are so small that we don't have a history of data for specific conservation units.
And would you also add the discussion we had then about that we need to work closely with First Nations and others with local information to better understand the habitat abilities?
Yes.
And then finally, with respect to recommendation number 9, we're not just we're not just talking about managing the in-river fisheries. We're talking about managing better all of the fisheries to deal with the changing environmental conditions and meeting commitments related to First Nations agreements and the wild salmon policy.
Certainly it applies to all fisheries with the understanding that the current trends have been focused on in-river fisheries because of the increasing water temperatures that have been observed in fresh water. So there's a special emphasis there.
taking into consideration cumulative effects that begin in the marine.
Okay, yes, it's a cumulative effects, definitely, that we're looking at.
So those are my questions on your report. I just have two remaining questions that go to the terms of reference that Commissioner Cohen is facing. The first one is, would you agree that when you look at overall the fisheries management on the Fraser River, that some of the key challenges for it are developing a management system that is collaborative rather than competitive? It's one of the challenges.
Yes?
You also agree that the challenge is shifting it from a harvest-focused management to a conservation-focused management?
I think that shift is already starting to occur.
We also agree that we will need to carefully look at incentives for ensuring that the changes that are necessary in the management are welcomed by those that respect and rely upon the fisheries.
That would be nice, yes. if
And
we're
do you
welcome.
agree also that we need to have an increasing willingness on the part of scientists to look a little broader, look outside the box, often is the expression, and not rely on historical data sets as being the only way of making hard decisions, but go broader than that?
I think it's the job of scientists to include all the information that they can obtain and provide the best advice they can.
And that clearly will include, as we go forward, relying and working more closely with First Nations and the expertise that they can bring to the table?
Yes, I've certainly experienced that firsthand, the benefits of doing that, and definitely support it.
Now, this is an even broader question, my next one, and this is my final question. What are your views on the extent to which DFO's management of Fraser River sockeye salmon historically and currently has contributed to the decline of the sockeye? To what extent has the current model with test fisheries located in the same areas as the strongest catch efforts and management systems that are reliant on inaccurate run timing groups and mixed stock fisheries contributed to the decline of sockeye?
Well,
Sorry, that's an extremely big question.
It is a big question. He's definitely got the expertise. You've qualified him as an expert.
It's not
in this
the
area?
expertise that's the issue. It's just there's so many assumptions in that question. I wonder if it could be either broken down or left in a more general way, or let the witness know that.
All right, I
Yes.
can. Okay, thanks, Wendy or Ms. Grant. I'll just leave it as the general. What are your views on the extent to which DFO's management of Fraser River sockeye salmon has contributed to the decline of sockeye?
Well, there are some that argue that the decline that we've seen were heavily related to environmental conditions that none of the managers have any control of in terms of ocean productivity. There's others that believe that we could have implemented a more precautionary approach earlier with regard to the management structure. There's a lot of complexities that you guys have heard tons about with regard to balancing the international responsibilities and the domestic ones, dealing with a lot of different groups. And I think that's all created challenges for implementing fisheries management rules, if you like, quickly to have the best impact on the stock. So I think I would hate to see that people think that it's the sole responsibility of the department or any one group to oversee the success of management. It's all our combined responsibility. The scientists bear some of the blame. The fishermen bear some of the blame. If the stocks have declined because of human decisions, we all are sharing some of the responsibility and blame for what's happened. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that the stocks that we have can produce substantial returns even under the current conditions. We got that very graphically in 2010. So I think the jury is out, if you like, on what exactly has caused and what which group has been more responsible or another. I think we have a collective responsibility to all work together to ensure that the stocks don't continue to decline if they are declining, and if they are improving, continue to improve.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, there's two more council to ask questions, and in fact, Mr. Lowe's would like to ask questions if there's time at the end, so I don't know if you wanted to take an afternoon break.
Hearing will recess for 10 minutes.